Welcome to Anatomy Day. Well, kind of. So this is a whiteboard presentation, and I thought what I'd do there is I'd use the whiteboard so that I could put a big flag on here. Obviously an awesome drawing of a flag. Just so that I could tell you, this is a kind of, I've read a lot of research, I've got a lot of experience kind of talk, so essentially, research and challenge all of this, because I really am going to tell you what I think's happening. I'm really not going to heavily reference this, which is kind of cool. It's kind of how I learn, but in the past I would just take what people tell me for granted and then come back with no research and no challenge. So that's my challenge to you. Challenge this. So I wanted to talk about what I'm hearing in the industry about range of motion. And so range of motion in the industry used to be about static stretching. And then what happened was it moved to dynamic, which people then call mobilizers. Within that, there was the evolution of 3 dimensions, and with that came load to explode, and also with load to explode came this idea of do what you do, and then or do what it does, and I'll explain that a little more. And so those two came together. They kind of form what people talk about now. And then I don't think results were as good as people expected. So we start to get a lot of reasons why. And with the reasons why came fascia. And that's something to think about as well. And so what was interesting to me, getting right back to the start, is, well, what is range of motion anyway, and what do we want from it? So usually with range of motion, what we're talking about is how much, and so by how much, more is good and less is worse in the majority of cases. And so as a trainer, quite a lot of the time you come across people who say, I'm too tight, I'm too stiff. And when they say I'm too tight and too stiff, often fascia gets bandied about. Now, I think this is because as a trainer, we've got it in our heads that we've got to think about range of motion and components. Now, the guy who came up with the 3D load to explode, the guy who put claim on that is a guy called Gary Gray. And so Gary Gray teaches a great set of methods. You should go and look at his blogs and things to see what he actually says. But essentially, as I understood it, you take a muscle, you take it into the 3 planes of motion, you take it to end range, and you do that with respect to the joint that you're working. And the goal is to increase the amount of range you have at that joint, and you do it dynamically so that there's a sort of aggressive change in direction, and so they call that the transformational point, and now they call it transformational zone. And I kind of like that. That made a lot of sense to me. And that was a full range thing. You do what the muscle does, you do what the joint does, and sometimes the reasons why that was working, though, weren't necessarily all that research based, in my opinion. And recently the fascial side came out. So I think when we started to look at everything, this wasn't a bad route to go. This was a good start. And what it did was it let people start to develop this thought process that there's more than one plane. We should be more dynamic. Muscles lengthen then shorten in what they call function. And so that was kind of cool. And that was a good step. And then start to think of this from a coaching perspective. Now, my outcome, if I'm a physical therapist or a physio, then my outcome versus a coach is different. So my outcome as a coach is improved performance. Quite often it's short term, but quite often that links to a long-term plan. Now, my goal, if I'm in some fed, say physio, let's call it rehab or recovery, my goal is to get you back. So get you back doing the stuff you want to do. And I have this extra thing to negotiate, and that's pain. I've got to negotiate pain. Which is interesting, because pain and biomechanics don't often, or don't always, don't often is not right, but they don't always link. Now, I've been reading a lot of blogs recently where they've been saying, no, they don't link, so it's all neuro. And then I've read other blogs that said, no, they all link, it must be fascia. And obviously I've read the stuff that say, well, it's all about mobility. And the problem we have in this side of the coin, and let me tell you, this is a specialist side of the coin, and this is not my side of the coin when it comes to training. But the problem you have here is it's very individual, and who knows? So the old sort of thought was, when you see someone who's injured, their biomechanics have definitely changed. Therefore, the biomechanics that are most consistent to the injury afterwards must be the biomechanics that caused the injury. And I'm not completely convinced that that's true. So the problem there is that we then go to correct these biomechanics to a model where the thing that people saw when they saw the injuries was removed, and therefore the client will feel better. And because quite often the client comes to see you as a physical therapist or someone who works with movement, they're already convinced that movement's their answer. You might be having a motivational or a nervous system or some kind of effect from a psychological point, which in that case will then go to reinforce that you were right because you did a physical thing and it worked, whatever work is. So there's a lot going on in that side of the business. What it means is this side of the business is prone to having techniques and theory thrown at it, and it's prone to have that happen because we don't know so much. And the problem is that a lot of the time it's based on poor research because it's hard to do good research, and it's based on people's results, and people's results aren't as clear cut as you'd think here. So from the injury perspective, you kind of need a lot of tricks in the bag for that one session to make someone feel better. And then the goal is to keep making them feel better long enough that they know that's how they should feel, and hopefully they become desensitized to their perception of pain as the tissue heals, or whatever other system people are using to make that client feel better and move more. So that's a good side of the industry to think about, but it's definitely not my side of the industry, and it's definitely something that's more complicated than you might think. Alongside this, obviously, you've got illness and the ability to diagnose, and so I read a lot of wannabe physios. I read some people who claim to be physios who aren't anyway, telling me all kinds of things about back pain and mechanics and fascia and foot mobility and all that kind of stuff, and actually they don't even have the ability to diagnose, and so they can't rule out all the other things. They're definitely not pain specialists, although some claim to be now. And so I think this is a good area. If you want to become a plastic guru, this is a good area to get into, because we don't know enough, which gives you enough space to make it up. Now, from the coaching perspective, I know this. And I think David Moyes knows this too now. David Moyes, the Man U manager, if you're listening to this from the US and don't know that. So coaching is about improved performance. You're measured on results. And so quite often results are short term. And although we know statistically if you're a 6, that means you're hardly ever a 6. You're normally an 8 or a 4. And so this happens in terms of performance. And it could be random. And so what our goal is to make sure that this middle line, that's a 6, on the long term becomes a 7 or an 8. So in terms of our performance, we move the average up. And so as we do that, we need to be very good in session to keep making sure that when we're down here in a 4, we have strategies to get back up to this 8. And when we're in an 8, we don't get carried away that we think we've found the way, and we make sure that we keep the concentration so we don't end up back down as a 4. But statistically, we're going to have good games and bad games, good times and bad times. Just on that, if we come across to our the space to be the plastic guru, then we can look at this and say, well, there is space to be a plastic guru if you want to. But what we need to know here is when you become this plastic guru, you're quite often going to see people when they're at their worst pain. So they're a 4. And then whatever you did, the next day they're going to be better in some way. Now, statistically, the chance that they're a 4 twice, if they're actually only at a pain or a problem of, say, of 6, statistically is quite low, perhaps. But if it does happen, and they're not deteriorating from a 6, then it's likely if you did this thing and it got better the next day, but then you go, oh, it works. And if it didn't, they come in the day after and say, no, it didn't work. You do it again and go, oh, look, we just kind of done it properly, or you must have needed 2, which is an interesting sort of thought process to go through, because did you need 2, or was it just a statistical thing, or did you need a bit more convincing? So anyway, I'm going to get off my plastic guru high horse, and let's get back to this coaching perspective. So from coaching, I need an improved performance. I need it short term because I have to keep winning you over psychologically and win the brain. By the way, the podcast, the guy from the Chimp Paradox book, who's now the England penalty guy, you should read his book if you can, because I think a lot of it happens upstairs. Another good book to read is The Inner Game of Tennis, because you as a coach have got to affect this here in some way. So short term, you can throw some techniques at people just to get the movement result you want, as long as you've got behind you the research, or at least the knowledge of what you're throwing in there, what the side effects are, what it's actually doing. For the long term, it's about consistently getting those results. So from a coaching perspective, it will be going from a conscious to a subconscious way of making or producing a movement. From a physical point of view, you'll be getting the tissues and the whole body's physiology to react, so that you get overload and then a change and an increase in performance to the genetic potential of that client, and then combine that with the ability to get psychologically to the point where you can recruit enough muscle fibers or that extra 10% when you need it. You're kind of on the right track for your individual athlete. There's some level of tactics there, because you might want to push the long-term change towards more strength and less speed, or more speed and less strength, or more endurance and less size, or there might be some things that you decide tactically for that player. But essentially, coaching is about that, getting that long-term plan right and getting the short-term plan to add up to make the long-term plan come together. Now that kind of takes me off the point of range of motion. So I want to bring this back. Here we go. So magically I cleared the board, but I want to bring you back to this thought of range of motion. Now, the system that I kind of like best, and that brought me out of being the traditional static stretching was this sort of 3D motion, this sort of lengthen to shorten, and all the other things that come wrapped up in this Gary Gray approach. But I kind of like the research that was out there that perhaps, and this is directly from there, perhaps flexibility, strength and power aren't separate, and you should always consider them together, which would make it a nervous system thing. However, what I wouldn't go as far as to say is it's a fascial thing, because people are making some big jumps because it has feedback to the nervous system. They presume, in my opinion, and from the research I've read, there's a lot more influence on the body than you might think. It might be a good indicator of what's going on around the body, but I don't think it plays the big part that people think, and I don't see any of the research to back that up. So range of motion for me really is not about range of motion. It's not about this. It used to be about this in my mind. I think me convincing clients it was about this helped them, but I don't think it is about this. I think that's too generic. I think that's a good skill in rehab and physical therapy, because I think, well, and I know, when you get injured, you start to lock down around positions, around the joints, and so getting any kind of range across 3 planes at pace, short pace, sort of a slow pace, a fast pace, whatever you want to do, is going to make you feel like you can move better, and going to make you feel freer, and that's going to have a psychological effect, and potentially it helps the body find its old movement patterns, and so that's kind of cool. But for me, and I talk about this a lot, I think a lot at the time, this is the 3D hammer, and people just presume if you hit the thing with the 3D hammer, then what a terrible looking hammer look. If you hit the thing with the 3D hammer, then you'll be alright. Just smash it. And so the problem there is that's not always the right thing. That's not always got transfer. And quite often that involves some big movements where what you want is short and sharp. More movement isn't necessarily better movement. Often more movement is a sign of a weakness in a motion, and some of the more traditional trainers will tell you that. So range of motion to me is about the skill, and that's important. And I wouldn't have got here without these guys, and a real big player was a guy called Franz Bosch. I hope I spelled his name right. If you get a chance, look at his book on running, because he's a coach, and that started to play into what I knew from coaching research, that range of motion is really the skill of the movement. So you've got to identify what the skill is, and so that does kind of run into what was spoken about here, but really for me it's about the sequence of events, and that should be the most important thing to replicate, in my opinion. So then the 3D component is not really 3D, but it's one plane, and it's one plane that consists of a way of describing sort of 3 forces that make that plane. So 3 forces make that one plane. It's that one plane we're trying to replicate. Now the problem is this skill needs to be matched. So the sequence is important, but the psychology is important as well, and so the structure is important. And if you start to bring this together, then you might say, well, why didn't somebody use the range of motion I expected? And that's really what we're saying when we're working on range of motion. Why aren't they using the range of motion I expected? And it's a far better question than, do they have enough mobility? And so if I'm asking the question why, then the answer's got to be, did they have the skill? And they might have had an injury that prevents them from accessing the skill. They might have never had the skill. And so they're the first two things that I want to kind of perhaps say injury, or perhaps they never had the skill. Perhaps this is still injured, so it's a structure. Perhaps they aren't still injured. Perhaps it's more psychology, and they've got to get over that injury. The person who protects their hamstrings because they always tie them, that could be important. So if it's the skill and it's an injury, it could be structural. If it's a skill, it's an injury, but it could be psychological. It could be that they've never had the skill, in which case then you've got to start training them to learn the skill. And so that might be a different component. It might be they have the skill, they're just plain lazy. And I don't mean necessarily consciously lazy, but they let exercise happen to them. They let movement happen to them. And so that's something I don't think I've ever paid enough respect to. And that's something you want to read the inner game of tennis to really sort of get an idea of what I mean. But if you let exercise happen to you, that means you're not in control of the motion. You're not trying to produce your best. And so I quite often rip people for demanding a certain level of technique, because I think movement and technique is all independent to the individual, the situation, their skill level, the outcome. I think everything's got to play. No movement's going to be the same twice. And although there's certain components that you'd expect for the most efficient movement, I think that's not necessarily going to be the case. That's what you want to see every time. However, there is a good movement and a bad movement for that individual, and they know. So if you said to them, I want to see you squat, and they show you a squat, and you say, how good was that? Like, how well did you do? Was that your best performance? They'll often be able to tell you, well, that was a 4 squat, and it couldn't be a 6 because, and they list the reasons, and you start to get them to identify what a good squat and a bad squat feels like. Now the skill here is you're fighting that, can I produce this great movement, but can I fight off anxiety about the great movement and not overthink this? That's why the inner game of tennis is quite cool. My interpretation of that is to get the client to brief their body. They want something really good, and then to get their thoughts away from that and to start looking at something else, trusting that their body will get that motion. And so that would be sort of the skill component of this range of motion, and I think that's really important. Now, as we said with injury, there might be just a structural thing. And so if the structure doesn't allow the movement, it ain't going to happen. And we're all built slightly differently, and we all have a history of changing our bodies that could be skeletal. And so perhaps it's just not possible. Perhaps that movement's not for them. Perhaps you're a runner, not a squatter. And so if the structure's stopping the range of motion, but you get no pain, you can perform tasks all the time. It doesn't matter if it looks asymmetrical. If you've not carried an injury and you're doing what's best, and you're meeting lots of different different challenges, so you're not getting that repetitive strain scenario, then it doesn't really matter. And perhaps it's just, hey, squatting's not for you, keep running. Or squatting's not really what your body likes to do, let's do your version, whatever it requires. So I start to look at all this range of motion and how it relates to the skill, and how you identify the skill, and how you start working on the skill. And I start to think, well, it's a little bit more than just taking a muscle to end range in 3D. If you're a bit further along that, it's a bit more than taking a muscle into end range in 3D in something that looks like the sport. I think there's a lot more to this in terms of the psychology and the coaching aspect of how you're going to get this client to perform this range well. Now, as we look at this, what does increase range of motion? That's got to be our real question. And so if we think about that, we need to really then jump into research and reading and say, well, what is it that we can improve? Now, from what I've read, and by the way, I just want to point out this. I really am waving this flag at the moment. From what I've read and the research I've put together for our courses, flexibility or range of motion, and let's call it flexibility for a second. So let's say we've agreed they need more range for whatever reason. There's two components. There's in session and then there's long term. And this is more about the psychology, the nervous system. This is a sort of central nervous system control, and this would be more structure. So if we start to do and ask the questions that I'd encourage all my trainers to ask as they start to build programs, I'd say, well, what's this? What's the limit to performance? And that's the question I'll always ask as a coach. And I think this is one that gives you different answers to one where you might be thinking of your client as a car or as a big connected structure of biomechanics. And so the limit to performance in session is going to be all the things that might psychologically set you to a point where you say that's enough range. So a lot of that's going to be fear. And it's either going to be conscious or subconscious, but it's going to be how you take the information that's fed back to the brain, and then how you use the info to decide. And by this, I'm not talking conscious at all, but it's where you decide to pick your range of motion. And so you might be in a really sensitive part of your body, trying to reach an end range. Your body fears danger, pulls you up early. You might then use a novel stimulus for the central nervous system to put it off that feeling. Then you might create more range. So whether you want that range, whether you want to be that guy that says I know more than the body, that's up to you. But what I'm saying is this is an interesting component to get to, because it's quite often fear related that stops you, whether that's conscious or subconscious, and that goes into history and psychology and experience and skill. And so in session it would be this, but over a long term then it would be structure. And if you want to change structure, you're looking at repeatedly using the range to its fullest sort of potential. Now, from everything I've read, I'm waving this flag because I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the research papers at this second in time, but from what I've read and what I've discussed with my friends who are academic, you need to be using the full range of motion against resistance and long term to get an actual change in range. All the stuff you see in session, that's all central nervous system, and that's either through trickery, which is sold heavily by a lot of people, and that's often novel. It's a novel stimulus, or I get in your head and make it up. So and I always see a result, so that's okay. So it's either those, or you've improved the skill. You've improved the skill, and by improving the skill, you've given them more confidence to get into range, and that's important. From the long term, from a structural perspective, you need to do against resistance in full range regularly, and just track what changes, and just bear in mind you're changing the structure and you're changing the skill. And with both of those over a long term, then you'll start to see a difference in the body. Now, I don't have the research with me, But it might be good to just jump onto PubMed and start saying, well, how long does it take to change? And in order to change structure, you might be talking about, you're more likely to be talking about muscle and tissue than you are bone. But there might be some bone changes as well that you get, especially sort of with your younger athletes. And so if you're looking at changing range of motion to increase flexibility, then if you're thinking, well, they have the range, but they don't have the skill, you'll start to see things in session. Quite often that's related to injury. If you think they haven't got the range, even if they had the skill, then that might be long term, and then that's related to resisted training. My big question as a coach would be, so what? As long as I see an increase in performance each session, I'm probably going to have done this, and this will probably find its own space anyway. And so if I go back to, can I make sure that you don't let movement happen to you? Can I make sure that when your form changes because you're getting fatigued, I can remind you to make exercise work and movements work in your way, at your level, and not let you just coast? If I can do that, if I can see the appropriate time to stop you because fatigue's stopping you perform as I need, if I can get all that to happen and keep you injury free, then I'm going to get the range of motion that I want from the client. It's going to happen naturally. It kind of, if we go back to the influencers, the 3D effect's interesting because I need to be able to decide what I want and sequence it, but it's not the end, a be all and end all. Sequences such as golf are so refined that the 3D, smash it with a 3D hammer approach is probably not the best thing you're going to do for that client. So it's bringing this all together to then get to that end point where you say, right, well, do I want range of motion? What's stopping it? What's my limit? What does the research say that I should do next? Let me apply that and get them to the end, to their end goal. Let me make sure that this is not an in-session thing and it's a long-term thing, or it is an in-session thing, and let me judge my results on that basis. The important thing there is, let me keep checking the research to see what's next. If this is a structural thing, it's not causing them pain, I consider they need more range of motion, let me go and check the research says range of motion would be a good idea. Then let me check the reasons why, and then let me make that happen in the way that we know most about at this point. What I want to make sure I do, though, is I want to make sure that I stay away from it worked. It seems like it makes sense. It's all interconnected, so it must be this that does that. I see clients and they've got this problem, explain why they don't have this problem after. I was injured and I did this and I feel better and no one else could help. All those statements, and I wouldn't want you to use them to take away from the person who's talking to you. I'd want you to use them as your internal flag. All those statements say, perhaps I've not looked at this in enough detail yet to be able to come back with a response. Now, this shouldn't change any technique you use. This shouldn't change anything you do really, other than how you think. So if you go to your research system and you decide using your sort of personal level of CARP that we mentioned the other day, if you do that and you decide, right, well, based on everything that I've just heard and thought about, what I'm going to say is I'm happy to do, and you pick a technique that someone else might not. Maybe you pick a scraping or a taping or a foam rolling, and someone might not pick any of those. Someone might pick one based on one client and then not on another client. Whatever, as long as you've applied CARP, you've had a research, you've had a read, you've made sure you've spent a lot of time trying to learn why this might happen or not happen, and what the problem might be with the client or not be with the client, and whether they need the range or don't need the range, whether it's skill or not skill, whether it's structure or central nervous system, whether it's injury related or not injury related, whether it's in their head or whether it's actually in their performance, then once you've got all that down, then you're in a good place to say, how do I improve range of motion with my client here's going to be my suggestion. I think you're going to find more times than not, it's not going to lead you to mobilizers, stretching, 3D techniques. It's going to lead you to something really specific for your client that might incorporate some, but not all of those things, and will definitely be, how do I get this to occur every session so I get less 4s and more 8s, and move that 6 average to a 7 average. Sorry this has been a bit of a rant, but I wanted to approach it because I think this is one of the misunderstood things in our industry. I'd really love you to prove me wrong on all of this. Being wrong is the thing that helps me get better. So get on my Facebook page and prove this wrong. Or put it in the comments in this YouTube box or wherever you want to go. I love constructive criticism, so love the read this paper, read that paper. I'd love to get your idea of the background of the paper, so you come in with something that's reasonable and we can have the discussion over. I'd love it if I was wrong in lots of places, because that'd give me the opportunity to share more and make things better. If you get anything from this and it helps you think about programming different, that'd be superb. And perhaps you should look at some of our courses, because I've got to say that just to help get this community of trainers into a place where we really are leading the industry. So it'd be great if you could join us and jump on a course and jump in our communities because you jumped on the course. It'd be great to hear feedback on this. I'm going to stop talking because I've been talking for ages and ages, and you probably deserve the rest. Thanks a lot. Bye.